He pops it. If everyone's happy, you have to all be happy. He'll pop it on Facebook.
You will be recorded. Your voices will be recorded, if that's all right. Is that all right?
Does that mean if we're miserable, it doesn't go on Facebook?
It means, well, no, you can be miserable and it can still go on Facebook as long as you're happy to be miserable.
I kind of don't like Facebook.
That's
and as long as you can make an address, date of birth,
you can access the video through YouTube if you're not on Facebook, so that's fine.
It's an ethical principle, is it, I imagine?
I just don't really want to be on there.
That's fine.
You mean Facebook or this video?
Right.
But it's
Anyway,
a YouTube channel.
It will be on a YouTube channel. What we did get from them was lots of little business cards, and at the last meeting we had on planning, we agreed that we would all try, because most of us have got other groups that we go to, and one way of spreading the word is to just take a set of these cards with a sticky thing saying Devon and a phone number and the Facebook email address, Facebook page, and then give it to all our mates and say, well, if you're interested, here you are, and it might just spread the word. So and Peter's organising that, getting the stickies, and then we'll hand them out next time. I think it must have worked somewhere else. Why did we? Oh, they were producing all these cards for free.
Cards,
And on the other side, it's positive money and a sort of a logo and that sort of thing. So that's cards. In terms of timetable for the year, last month we had our planning meeting and we agreed to continue with monthlies, besides other things, monthly meetings. And I've sent you the timetable, more or less alternate Wednesday, Thursdays, because some people can't do Thursdays, some people can't do Wednesdays. Here, usual time, 7 o'clock, talk starts 7:30. And then we can have the room. There's only one time when we can't have the room. I think we have to go upstairs or something, but otherwise we're here. Are people happy? Have you looked at the timetable? Are you happy? We can change it. But if you're happy, we'll just stick to that. It's about the 3rd or the 4th or sometimes the 5th, but towards the end of the month, except for December when it's early. Yeah? Happy?
Yes.
Anyway, I assume that you haven't said it's awful, so, by email, people haven't said. In terms of talks, we've got nothing for next month yet, so if you've got any ideas who might talk, let me know. Probably Tony Greenham. He says by October. Tony Greenham is the guy setting up the community bank, the Southwest Community Bank.
Right, it's actually happening.
Seems to be actually happening, and he's got his sort of first shareholder meeting next month or something, or first offering some things, a launchy sort of occasion. And I'll send you details of that as soon as we get it. But I thought it would be quite interesting to get an update from him on it and on community banking in general. Yeah? Happy with that? And he's apparently going to be living permanently in Exeter from September. So he's a captive to an extent. I thought probably November. I'm in touch with the economy students here at Exeter, and I'll probably try and nobble one of them to give a talk in November on something. And I thought probably December Richard Werner has got quite a good video of a talk he gave, reasonably short. And we haven't actually had a video of Richard talking. We've had some of his slides. For those that don't know, Richard is very anti-central bank, and he's the guy that invented the word quantitative easing when he was in Japan. So we've got a video. We might have a video of him in December. That's the sort of That's the sort of idea.
Is it a recent video or is
Yeah, sort of end of last year-ish sort of one.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's reasonably short. He was talking at a banking thing in Germany, but they all speak English. Then Richard, who should be coming, Richard
Seaford.
who's based here in Exeter, will probably give a... here's Richard here. Will probably give a talk early next year on his latest research into money in ancient times.
Not just ancient times.
Modern and ancient.
Big themes.
Great. So that may be in January. Are you around in January?
I think the date you suggested, I am, yes.
Okay.
Very solid.
Then I'm not sure about Feb, and then March, Neil Smith, who some of you may know is lecturer in economics at Plymouth and also teaches here as well. He will have finished his PhD and will be free in about March to talk about that and anything else. Yeah. So those are the things that are coming up, but you must know what you would prefer, or other things that we can add, and we can ask people. On here is the Ufcombe Green Day. Now, for the last 5 years, we've gone to the Exeter Green Fair and had a stall and found it quite fun, and we introduced, a lot of people have been and joined our group from that particular stall. There isn't one this year, but there is, and they phoned me up and said, we've got a cancellation, we've got a spare table for a stall, would you like it? And I said, yeah. But that's on the assumption that you'll help me, some of you will help me run it, on the 22nd of September. So, anybody, any takers? Peter, it's quite near Ufcombe, isn't it?
On the way to Lumpton, isn't it? Or just past
yes,
yes. It's not too far.
So it's just up the M5 a bit. And so please volunteer, and if you've never done it before, come for a couple of hours. But usually the fairs are quite fun. They've got lots of different green stalls inside and outside the village hall.
Could you put an email
round?
Because I haven't got my diary with me.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah. Has everybody got a gazebo? You know, one of the, it's 3 by 3 metre by 3 metre gazebo. That might be able to help. It's just that the one I get my hands on is probably not available. Anyway, could you, again, I'll send around an email.
But is it not undercover? It says Mage Lake Hall.
Yeah, but we're outside.
Oh, oh dear.
There's outside stalls and inside stalls. So that between 10 and 4 on that day. So anyway, grateful if you would, some people would volunteer. All we need is 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. Actually, I mean, you don't need that many. But the more, the merrier. So please. The other thing we're trying to do is arrange a big event in Exeter and Plymouth, probably hosted by the university's economics department. And if anybody's got some ideas of who we might invite, the idea is we would sponsor someone to come and talk, but they would host it. And in that way we get a good person doing something, a talk that we want, but they send out the invitations to all theirs. You can say you get a range of. So again, if anyone got any ideas who we might invite, please let me know. I think I thought of 2 people. There are a number we can invite. Right. So shall we get on with the meeting? The idea was that some of us read the blogs from Positive Money, and sometimes they come up with some quite good things to talk about in their in their blog, and we thought we would pick 3 or 4 and discuss their content and criticise what they've said, if that's appropriate, but just make it, if you like, a point of leading the discussion. And 4 of you have offered to take one of the blogs. And the first one here is History of QE, 3 ways of the bank's analysis. The bank that falls short of history and future QE. Richard, would you be
Yes.
you happy to do that?
10 minutes?
10 minutes? 15 minutes? Do you want to? Yeah.
10 minutes.
So the history and future of QE was a blog on the Positive Money website and criticising the Bank of England's analysis of falling short.
Yes, it's a very short blog. If I just read it out, it would take less than 10 minutes. But it's quite interesting. It's about QE, quantitative easing. It's about a speech recently made by a man called Ben Broadbent, who is a senior official in the Bank of England, Deputy Director of Monetary Policy. And it makes 3 criticisms. And I'll tell you what the criticisms are. That's all quite simple. And then I might try to extend the criticisms a bit and say what I think about Ben Broadbent. Because I did read his speech. It's not a couple of hours I'd necessarily recommend to everybody, but I did read it. And I read the blog, and that's all I've done. Well, there are 3 criticisms, and Ben Broadbent is very keen to defend the policy of quantitative easing, which was introduced in 2008, when, as Mervyn King later put it, the banks, the commercial banks, are not creating money. It's their job to do that. And therefore we, the Bank of England, have to do it. And that's the basis of quantitative easing. It's a new way, or virtually a new way, of ensuring the money supply by the Bank of England buying assets from basically from financial institutions. They didn't give them the money, as is sometimes thought. They bought the government bonds. So it was a kind of redistribution of who's holding what. The Bank of England then had a huge balance sheet of government bonds, gilts, and the commercial banks then had a lot of cash, which in theory they should then use in order to get the economy going, lend to businesses, or even to build houses or whatever. But it was down to them, the financial institutions, to pass this money on into the real economy. Though the real economy is not a phrase which Broadbent uses, I would say. Anyway, so Broadbent's very defensive about it. He doesn't really say what good it did in this speech. He's keen to defend it against 1 or 2 criticisms. And he admits that it's quite difficult to know whether it did good or harm, or how much good or harm it did, because there are so many other factors at play in this period. As in any complex modern economy, there are about. Economics is an extremely inexact science. It's not really a science at all, economics. Or it's what I call a conditional science. You can say, if so-and-so happens, then so-and-so. But it's not like studying physics or chemistry. It's quite different. It's much closer to the humanities. I do the humanities. And that's not a science in any normal sense of the word science. So the 3 points, or rather, what Positive Money's blog does is to address the 3 ways in which Broadbent is trying to defend the effects of quantitative easing. And the first one is about the prices of shares and of houses, which, the criticism goes, have been inflated by quantitative easing. So this money that's gone into quantitative easing, 445 billion over the years, has not, so the criticism goes, gone into the real economy, not into production, not into the creation of real wealth, but into speculation, into the purchase of shares, which of course may help the production of real wealth, may not, it just may boost the price of the shares, and into the boosting of the price of housing. And Bernanke says, not Bernanke, Broadbent says, the evidence is that actually these things over a 10-year period haven't really risen in real terms. And the blog makes criticism of this by saying, well, he's using pretty odd methods of deciding whether these things have risen or not. So in the case of shares, he's looking at very short-term movements in shares, which resulted from the announcement that there would be quantitative easing. And actually, it's very, very difficult to say what causes the rise and fall of shares. It seems to me pretty likely that if you flood the market with masses of money that can be put into buying shares, then that's likely to inflate the price of shares in a general way. But Broadbent says no, there's a bit of evidence that suggests that didn't really happen. As for housing, the criticism made of Broadbent is that he looks at housing overall, the national figure, and says, well, in real terms, the price of houses in real terms hasn't gone up over this 10-year period. But what positive money are able to do very simply, and this is actually, of course, a completely devastating and obvious criticism, is to show that in London they've gone up hugely, and the rest of the country they haven't, and the North East and so on. And so if you take the overall figure, that completely misrepresents the picture, which is that in London and the South East they went up hugely. And this is part of the famous regional imbalance that bedevils our economy and has produced Brexit and so on and so forth. That's not what they say, I'm sort of adding bits on. But that's an easy win for positive money. But he does illustrate the kind of sleight of hand that a senior official in the Bank of England is doing. Now, the second criticism of Broadbent, and this isn't exactly about Broadbent trying to defend quantitative easing, I'll come back to that in a moment, is about unwinding. Now, quantitative easing was always and is taken to be a temporary measure. You do it for a certain time in a crisis, then you unwind it so that this vast balance sheet, which the Bank of England has, or has in the USA, then is reduced over a period. You go back to normality, and that creates also, or potentially creates all sorts of problems, which I won't go into now, I don't have time. But to put it very crudely, if you, according to Broadbent, and there's clearly some truth in this, you've saved us from a massive recession by pumping lots of money into the economy. When you take it out, then that could land you back in square one with a recession. But that's the basic issue, it's as simple as that. And of course the cast of mind is saying, well, quantitative easing is the solution to our crisis. The crisis passes, we don't need it anymore. But the more I look at this stuff and think about this stuff, which isn't very deeply, the more I think, well, actually, no, it isn't a matter of there being a normality and then a crisis in 2007 to 8. Let me get back to normal again. When you tinker around with a few regulations from the banks, there won't be another crisis. Absolutely not. The crisis is still with us. I mean, just the levels of household debt, for example, which were massive before 2008, apparently even greater now. This hasn't been solved. There are radical problems with the economy, which Broadbent seems to have no concern with. But then he's just got a particular technical spot with the Bank of England. So that's the second one. And the third one, which I think is positive money's very powerful position, is that when Broadbent says, well, clearly the quantitative easing saved us from dire position of recession and so on, or depression. Well, no doubt there is some truth in that. I mean, it would be very bold to deny that if the economy is short of money and you put 445 billion into it, some of it isn't going to solve the problem. It solves the problem to some extent. But Broadbent's only comparing two things, which is not using quantitative easing and using quantitative easing in the mode that the Bank of England did. He says the second is better. Well, of course, what positive money says, there are other ways of putting money into the economy, rather than just handing it over to financial institutions in exchange for assets, and just hoping that things will be all right. And that is the again, a powerful point made by the blog. Positive money, but they're making this point actually, of course, all the time. They have a project of sovereign money and so on. You could, rather than putting £445 billion into the accounts of private institutions, you could use it to build infrastructure, build housing, invest in the economy, or you could use it as helicopter money, in which you simply put it in, some of it in everybody's bank account. Now that sounds crazy, but only because we're so, as it were, trapped by inherited forms of thinking about economics that it sounds crazy. It's not crazy at all. And even Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve in the USA, has now come out in favour of this. So you couldn't get more conventional establishment than that. So it's not that Broadbent, and Broadbent doesn't even mention this stuff. And this brings me to my final point. I read Broadbent and I get the impression of what the problem is. And the problem is, Broadbent is a highly intelligent man, no doubt, but having worked in the academy, in the university for 40 years, I know this problem intimately. It affects not just economics, it affects every subject. That in order to develop impressive expertise, you have to limit yourself. You have to have parameters within which you're doing your thinking. And you must not stray outside those parameters. And Broadbent is absolutely a classic case of that, it seems to me. Moreover, this is reinforced, no doubt. You get a job in the Bank of England, you have your parameters decided for you anyway. At the end of the speech, he says, our job is the control of inflation. Well, great. What about everything else? I mean, the point is that there are two fundamental issues that any economist must take as their starting point. One seems to me, is well-being, which depends on the real economy, people producing value, not producing money, producing real value. And if you don't do that, doesn't matter how much debt you rack up, doesn't matter how many financial mechanisms you think of, it doesn't matter how many financial wheezes you come up with, in the end, if a nation is not producing value, it's going to have dire problems, and that will catch up with it. And Bernanke has no mention of the real economy. He'd probably say that isn't my job. And the other thing, of course, is inequality, which Bernanke mentions very briefly Broadbent mentions briefly once by quoting a study in which he says actually inequality hasn't risen as a result of quantitative easing. There are plenty of other studies that show that it has, but of course that isn't really the issue. He doesn't want to get into that here. The issue is that this is his only reference to the issue, is to cite the one paper in a footnote which defends quantitative easing against the charge of increasing inequality. It seems to me pretty obvious it's increased inequality. But even if you disagree with that, what is absolutely central and beyond dispute is that the Bank of England, at least in its statements, has no interest in inequality. It has interest in a series of criteria which are, as it were, decided for it by a power structure. So real economy and equality and justice, these are the two things completely left out of Broadbent's speech. And those are the things, of course, positive money is concerned with, and why we need positive money. Okay, that's 10 minutes, isn't it?
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. And discussion.
In terms of whether in terms of whether various sort of asset prices rose as a result of quantitative easing, my recall is that the Bank of England actually stated at the outset that their intention was to raise asset prices on the supposition there'd be some trickle-down effects.
Yes, indeed, there are statements like that, I believe. Moreover, even if one ignores, that's perfectly true. And an additional point is that even if within the narrow terms that Broadbent is thinking in, that asset prices haven't gone up, then of course you could say, well, that doesn't mean quantitative easing didn't have an effect on asset prices. They could have gone down considerably, or maybe they should have gone down considerably. Quantitative easing may have prevented them falling. In that respect, had an upward pressure on asset prices. Shares, I mean, maybe the share market's gone down and up and so on, and at the moment, the last few years, it's on a big up. And there are plenty of people that doesn't affect, because 40% of shares are owned by the richest 5% of the population. So I take that point, and the price of assets in itself, it seems to me completely meaningless as an economic indicator. I know it may have, people can then borrow on the price of their houses, which is increased, they can borrow more money, therefore they can spend more money. But that doesn't actually help the real economy one little bit. So, I mean, people might say, oh, well, we want to keep asset prices up. Well, I mean, okay, just spell out why you want to do that and how it's going to help the real economy.
Particularly when the assets are second-hand. They're not new assets.
Well, yes,
where the price is being kept up, or
Yeah.
the price where the value is being created. It's always second-hand assets where the price goes up. They're just second-hand, not creating anything.
Indeed, if somebody's house goes up enormously in value, or if somebody's share portfolio goes up in enormous value, in itself, I cannot see why that is desirable.
No, I mean, presumably the theory is that an increase in nominal equity will make people feel rich and then make them invest in supposedly productive things.
Yes. They can invest, or they'll be more inclined to borrow at the slightly lower end.
Yeah.
Yes.
But they won't invest if the economy is tanking, which it is.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't work.
It's quite interesting that so many years after the crash and after QE, and so much research that's been done on it, he is still so narrow in his thinking, isn't it? I mean, Mervyn King's written a book. There's some good books out about all the issues, and he hasn't picked them up.
Right,
to be
What's
fair,
Mervyn King's position again? Sorry, I've forgotten Mervyn King. I know
he was before Charney. He was the guy.
He was the governor.
Ah,
I mean, it might be being a little bit unfair to him, because if he was here, he might say, okay, but those are issues. I was talking about something else in my speech. I'd given myself a narrative. However, I suspect that's actually unlikely to be true. The way institutions work is that people are assigned particular tasks. It's an institutional problem. It's a kind of institutional paralysis. He has his remit. If you start introducing these big concepts, it makes life very complicated. This is the same in almost every academic subject. It's an academic problem as well as an institutional
It's a
problem.
deeper problem. There too, isn't it, to do with systems thinking, or a lack of systems thinking. In the sense that people can't see.
Yes.
Institutions don't appear to see the knock-on effects of the fact that the whole thing is interconnected.
Yes.
And you can't
of
possibly
course,
solve these kinds of problems without taking some kind of systems view.
yes, and I mean the Bank of England is a technical mechanism. It's not meant to represent us. It no doubt has terms of reference that decided at some point, and it all goes back to the late 17th century, which is where our current system is still located, in a sense, curiously enough, because it was so successful. People who represent us are our MPs. So, but I say, it's the MPs to decide on these. But the trouble is, the MPs don't know anything. I mean, I'm referring to statistics. About 90% of them, at one point, not realising that money is created by commercial banks. Most of our MPs did not know when the survey was taken. Maybe things have improved. Did not know how money is created. These are the people who are supposed to be representing us. So on the one hand, you've got the people representing us, who may be very good people, or maybe very intelligent people, and in touch with their constituents. And then on the other hand, you've got the people who are not representing us, and they're the experts, each of them within a very narrow set of guidelines. So there's this vast area in between, this great vacuum, which is not occupied as a vacuum, and unless it is occupied, then you're never going to get any serious change for the better.
Although, I mean, in relation to MPs haven't got the faintest idea, have they? But then, until roughly the last 20 years, when people like Michael Rowbottom and Stephen Zalando and so on started writing books, almost nobody, certainly very few of us, I suspect, would have known these facts either. We've sort of stumbled upon them. I don't know how. I say for myself anyway. I stumbled upon it, and then it was sufficiently compelling to look into it a lot further. But without happening to stumble upon it, I'd still be completely ignorant about it.
Yeah.
So it's not that surprising.
I mean, it's pretty odd. I mean, go back to the criticisms of quantitative easing made by the Positive Money blog, and they make good criticisms. But there's a sort of broader issue that comes out of it, which is that it would seem self-evident to these people, each one in his or her niche, that you've got this £445 billion that you give it to, but you put it in the as what's called reserve money into the private banks, and just hope that it's going to go further. Now, if you came from Mars as an intelligent alien and looked at this, you'd say this is completely insane. What on earth do you think you're doing? If you want this money to be spent productively, let's spend it productively. If you want this money to go into the economy, put it in people's bank accounts. Don't put it into a channel where most of it goes into completely useless boosting of assets and shares.
Do you think it's really about accountability? Do you think that they would rather not? They pass on the responsibility of what to do with the money.
Yes. I do think
a
that.
Question of responsibility.
Yes, and they'd say it's not our job. But that's precisely the issue. That there's a kind of institutional paralysis. The institutions have been set up in such a way that it seems obvious to these people that that's the only thing you can do. Unless you get institutional change and a change in understanding that can go with it, then you're going to go on in this mode of failing to deal with the big issues.
Does anybody remember the window? I can't remember the name of the window that was mentioned.
Window guidance, yeah.
I don't know if it was that. But you go from the Overton.
Acceptability.
I feel like that's useful to recap for people who weren't there for that. You go from extreme, something that sounds extreme to somebody, and then it becomes moderated, and then eventually it becomes normal policy, and then you can go the other side, and it gets gradually more and more extreme. I remember there was an example of Donald Trump. If Donald Trump says something sort of outrageous, but by saying it, it brings it slightly more in the norm because he is an authority.
Yeah.
So more people can think, oh, this is not quite so extreme anymore.
It becomes
Overton's window is basically how politics works.
It is.
I can't remember why, but I
It's
thought.
the boiled frog syndrome too, isn't it?
Okay, yes. Yeah, but this was related somehow.
I must yield the floor to somebody else now.
I mean, just one point. It's not that long ago when the Bank of England did tell the banks how they were to, how they were to create, who they were to give bank loans to. It was only 20, 30 years ago. So, you know, they've got no institutional memory either.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Was that in the UK?
That was in the UK. It was,
Because I heard back
certainly after the war, it was, and not just Japan, particularly in Asia.
And that's window guidance, isn't it?
Window guidance.
Well, maybe in Germany they still do it. I don't know.
Well, Vernon would say they don't have to because the small banks, that's all their job is to sell, is to lend to productive people. Thanks, Richard.
Pleasure.
Very much. Great. Regulation. Basel III. Chris.
Oh yeah.
And I think that they were saying, does it really work?
Fran wrote a blog basically summarising her contribution to, I think it was a Westminster Chamber of Commerce discussion on building resilience in the financial industry. And the three things that she was asked to address, and was the subject of the blog, were sort of ring fencing, i.e. separation of retail and investment banking, Basel III regulations, and sort of competition in the banking industry. And on the first topic, on ring fencing, said, well, firstly, it's been watered down tremendously from what it could, from sort of a complete separation of retail and investment banks, because retail banks can pass on capital to their sort of corresponding investment arms as long as they meet certain of their own sort of stated criteria. Secondly, that it doesn't really work anyway because through securitisation, the bundling up of different classes of of loans and selling them off on the open market, retail banks can pass off sort of dodgy products into the wider banking system anyway, and sort of said that the common perception that retail banking is basically safe and investment banking is dodgy was contradicted by the fact that the 2008 crash started with subprime mortgages in the States, and that Northern Rock, for instance, was overexposed on unwise mortgage lending and had to borrow heavily on wholesale markets in order to support that. So that, anyway, ring fencing, I suppose she's saying, is sort of badly conceived in the first place as a panacea, and in any case, it's sort of the way that it's apparently going to be implemented doesn't really work. So that was the first point. The second point on sort of Basel III regulations, which is, Basel, I think, as far as I know, Basel is, the significance of Basel is where the Bank for International Settlements is based, and this is a sort of a focal point for sort of international banking regulation, and the idea here is to impose greater sort of capital holding requirements on banks so as to make them supposedly more stable. Again, said this has been watered down considerably. The banks, apparently, their capital requirements will be decided sort of almost bank by bank, as far as I could gather from the blog, on the basis of assessing the risk weighting of the loans that the banks actually hold as assets, and made the point that what might appear in general terms to be a sort of a low risk asset at one point, i.e. mortgages before 2008, can change depending upon fluctuations in the market. Secondly, that banks are only going to be asked in general to hold about 3% of assets as actual capital, i.e. presumably as distinct from sort of loan assets, and that this is shown to be completely insufficient. So at least 20% would be necessary. And I want to make another point which I've forgotten, so I will look at my notes. Oh yeah, and that deciding on sort of banks' sort of capital holding, and the point of holding more capital is that if you have to hold more capital back, you can't actually make as many loans. That if banks are required to hold more capital on the basis of supposedly riskier lending policy, then banks which lend to small and medium enterprises are going to be held to require more capital, and therefore this will actually tend to militate against lending to SMEs, who are generally the sort of productive ones in the economy. A point on competition in banks, said her main point was that, basically in Britain anyway, we've got sort of 5 major banks who have been shown to be too big to fail, and the rest are really nowhere, and that the government policy seems to be oriented to the sort of the British banking industry, the finance industry, rather than to considering the ways in which financial banking and other financial services actually impact people in the country, the people who are the government is supposed to be representing. And I mean, I'm sure these are all seem to be good points for Fran's. What mainly struck me is that she was sort of speaking on the basis of a symposium which sort of has an informing premise that stability in the banking industry, resilience, is a good thing. Now, I guess we don't actually want the finance industry to collapse, because if that happens, everybody's sort of daily lives sort of go down the plug hole, because everybody in a monetized economy requires to be able to make payments, to deal in money, to deal with anybody about anything pretty much, except in one's sort of families and intimate relationships. So although to that extent we might say that sort of we've all got an interest in resilience in the financial industry, sort of beyond that basic point, I would say we actually sort of in many ways want the opposite. If we are supporting a notion that a resilient finance industry is a good thing, what we are supporting is the notion that it should go on doing what it sort of does best, which is increasing the indebtedness of the vast majority of people to enrich a few. So I was a bit depressed reading the blog, because it seemed like it was sort of possibly an understandable sort of interaction with the wider world of finance on positive money's behalf to gain a general credibility and seem responsible. But actually, it seemed to be buying into a lot of premises that I'm not sure that positive money would actually really be supporting at all.
True.
So,
What do you mean by ring fencing? Sorry.
ring fencing is separating out the retail, i.e. the retail arms of banks, i.e. those that hold current accounts, from the investment arms of banks, i.e. the merchant, what used to be called merchant banks, I guess, so that one cannot simply have a sort of a balance sheet and financial interchange at will between those particular arms of a given bank. I mean, if HSBC has got a retail arm and an investment arm, then as things have stood, capital sort of money, sort of deposits can be passed from the retail arm through to an investment arm to do whatever it will.
So,
And that was held to be a major reason why the 2008 crash happened, because of sort of dodgy financial practices, derivatives, etc., which were supposedly dreamt up by the investment arms of banks, and by implicating the retail arms, they sucked in ordinary depositors and account holders.
so simply trying to simplify what you just said. So, ordinary person puts money in the bank can do whatever they like with that money, and they can invest it. So that
If they make unwise investments,
retail.
if the bank goes belly up because of unwise investment decisions, then either sort of ordinary account holders lose their money, or if there's deposit guarantee schemes, then the government has to stump up on behalf of the depositors.
Yeah.
I mean, the word resilience in this context can be in relation to different things, can't it? You have a very resilient financial system which is resilient to ripping people off. But in the present context, since 2008, it tends to mean resilient in the sense that it's not going to produce another great crash.
Yes.
And one should remember that the last great crash had nothing to do with public indebtedness, contrary to popular mythology. It's amazing how that lie has been able to be sustained.
Right, yes.
It's not the only big lie that people generally believe, but it's a very important one. It was a result of originally private indebtedness, because it started in the USA with individuals who borrowed money, mortgages to buy houses, not being able to pay up. And that produced a crisis in institutions, but the origin of the problem was private indebtedness. But private indebtedness is, as I said earlier, at its highest level in this country since the Battle of Hastings. It's absolutely massive. So, in a sense, there's a dynamic which I don't know about the United States. Maybe they've sorted the problem. But there's a dynamic in which, at a certain point, people are just unable to repay their debts because interest rates go up or for whatever reason. And the house prices fell in the United States, and people are unable to pay their debts. That moves from being a problem of private indebtedness to being a problem of institutional collapse, instituting institutions, which then spreads to other institutions. And that is the form and structure of the crash of 2007 to 8. So that financial resilience, any so-called financial resilience that does not take that into account, is a waste of time, really, isn't it?
Right. I think resilience also, what we really need resilience for is the payment systems. That's what, because they're all run privately. Now, then if banks collapse, then the payment system collapses. What we really need is a state-run payment system.
But also deposits. You lose your deposits. I mean, that's our biggest
that's
worry
guaranteed. But yes, I suppose so.
Private.
I mean, that was the Positive Money's idea of having digital cash mirroring the accounts of the Bank of England, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Which is
what's interesting about this ring fencing is that in the States, the Volcker rule, and he was the early and clearly a very good Fed Reserve chairman, had this rule that they weren't allowed to combine.
Well, that was the Glass-Steagall Act, wasn't it, from 1934 or whatever, and actually it was Bill Clinton's administration that approved the what's the word I'm looking for? The dismantling of the abolition, sorry, of the Glass-Steagall Act.
But they still had the rule that you couldn't actually merge the two. And that's why, so in the States, the thing that was creating the money was the shadow banks, because that was the way to get round that rule. So you're not allowed to, these investment banks, like Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers, weren't allowed to accept deposits. So they did this shadow banking, and which created money in place. And that's why, and that's 50% of the indebtedness was shadow banking created in the States, and only 25% here. So my point is that ring fencing won't work because unless you deal with the shadow banks as well. And in fact, so again, it seemed to me that she missed the point that regulation will always fail.
Right.
The banks will always get round it. They'll find a way.
So what's the alternative to regulation?
Well, maybe one needs a slightly more savvy version of regulation, or
no, you make all banking illegal except what is specifically permitted. That's the way round it. Otherwise, regulation will always be chasing your tail.
Yes, I mean,
What way? Say again.
All banking will be illegal except what is specifically permitted.
Okay, the other way around.
Yeah. So.
But what would you permit?
Well, that's a whole other subject. Yeah.
Yeah.
but I mean, you've sort of suggested that the sovereign money proposal is kind of slightly sort of behind the eight ball, because it doesn't actually deal. It doesn't have any explicit provisions to deal with shadow banking.
Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me it ought to be possible to. It should not be beyond the wit of Positive Money or its supporters to formulate something which will deal with shadow
Could you
banking.
define shadow banking for us?
It's the ability to create money without accepting deposits.
Yes. But isn't it a legal issue there? I mean, if it was easy to do that, then they'd all be doing it.
But they are, aren't they?
It is quite complicated. They are doing it, yeah.
Yeah,
But it is quite complicated. I mean, you have to have the special, securitise the loans, and then you lend the loans, and you get money from the money markets, and you bring the money in, and then you re-lend that.
You have to have a certain amount of capital to start with.
Not really. Very little. Really. We could do it. I think we should.
Yeah, we could be the most wealthy Positive Money group.
So you need regulation. I mean, as you were saying, it shouldn't be beyond the wit of us. But it's something we haven't looked at as Positive Money. We need to.
There is.
That's maybe
Martin Wolf said something about it which sort of makes sense to me, which is you can have it so that shadow banking is kind of understood generally by everyone to be the quote like Wild West, where if you take part, everything you've got on the table, as it were, can be lost, and the government's not going to help you if things go wrong. So that's kind of a harsh but fair situation, because what we had was the banks backing up all of that crazy unknown shadow situation. The government ended up like taking the hit when it all went wrong, right? So as long as the people who were taking those big risks then don't end up jeopardizing the whole payment system, which is what happened in 2008. Yeah, as long as you can create some kind of firm barrier there, then you can allow some of the more.
Well, sorry, are you suggesting that a sovereign money system could coexist with a Wild West in shadow banking as long as it was somehow quarantined?
Realistically, you're always going to have people doing interesting things that the government is a few steps behind, because that's what humans are like. You can't make human ingenuity illegal. Like, it just doesn't You know, you
No,
can't ban.
you can regulate certain outputs of human ingenuity, however.
I don't.
Well, like manufacturing and dispensing sort of sarin, for instance.
But when it comes to money and banking specifically, it's incredibly hard to know what's even going on out there. Like, I mean, we've just had like cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and all of that explode, and the stuff that they're doing with that and the potential that that has is like the central banks and the government are way behind understanding what the potential of that could be. From like, and so are most of the people involved in the movement as well. To be honest, like it's so that's a real game changer that came out of nowhere when it comes to regulation. And they're still deciding what it means and like whether it's legal or whether it counts as money and stuff. Well, one thing about Bitcoin that I found really interesting is that it's going to be regulated under like the liability laws cover them as financial instruments in some way. That's quite interesting. So if you take part in cryptocurrencies, you might be liable legally for some of the repercussions because you're providing a service in a sense. So there might be some interesting outcomes to do with the law there. That's a really interesting area. There's a bit of a sidetrack. But the point I was making is that a sovereign money system does sort of allow for the shadow banking problem in that it just lets it be, in a sense, as long as you can keep it away from, as long as everyone knows if they're taking a risk or not, and people who don't want to take a risk aren't.
But it's not. That's not the issue. That's fine. The point is, it will destroy the financial system
because it would be creating money that was indistinguishable from the sovereign money.
What would be cryptocurrencies or
no, we're talking about shadow banking.
Well, shadow banking, I can't see. I'm probably being really stupid here, but I cannot see the difference between shadow banking and a debt-based economy, a debt-based banking system in the first place.
Because currently banks create money by creating deposits, i.e. making loans. In this case, shadow banking is basically a way of enabling the creation of money without, in a formal sense, making loans or creating deposits. Therefore, legislation to prevent banks creating deposits out of nothing wouldn't actually deal with the shadow banking money creation.
How do you make money without making loans?
Yes.
No, you have to make the loans. You make the loans.
Sorry, all right.
Okay, so how is it different from, excuse me again, how is it different from the current debt-based system?
It isn't.
That they can't know. So shadow banking is the debt-based system, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it's a particular variant of it.
Okay.
It's because you're not receiving deposits, you are not subject to government regulation.
That's the key.
Between deposits.
That's the key, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that right?
Yeah, you get away with it.
Yeah.
Whatever you do, then they can't.
So
the whole history of the economy consists of people being ingenious and finding ways around, and the government then catching up. If the government disaster, it's always in the end had to catch up. I mean, we look at the history of the 19th century, the regulation of banking and so on. So we just have to keep insisting that we regulate.
Yeah. Just on a technical point there, I'm not. It isn't to do with the limitations aren't to do with any particular ratio between deposits and loans, are they? Because isn't that a certain liquidity ratio which in Britain was abolished in 1981? Currently we don't have one.
Yeah, that's right.
So what is the ratio? When you say 3%?
Oh no, that's a capital ratio. That's sort of holding back a certain amount of capital. That's not a liquidity ratio in terms of the ratio of deposits to lending.
By holding back, they're not holding back. They're still investing that money, but the money is owned by their shareholders, they'll lose that money if they need to spend it. For a bad debt.
That's what a deposit is.
It's assets rather than
bank
money in
equity.
the bank, if that makes sense.
But they still lose that money.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. I mean,
the difference between a deposit and capital is who owns the money, basically.
no.
Whether it's the bank or the
Well, the bank owns the deposit, and the bank owns the.
So what's the difference?
Capital in this sense, as I understand it anyway, is is not actually an asset in the form of a loan. I mean, a lot because loans. When a bank makes, when a bank makes a loan, that's an asset to the bank, is it not? The fact that it is owed that money. Whereas capital, in the sense of a certain retaining a certain capital, is assets which are not loans.
That's right. So, but they're both liabilities of the bank. One's a deposit, which people lend the bank money, and that's a liability of the bank because they've got to pay it back. And the other is a liability of shareholders. They put money into the bank as shareholders. And they obviously have to pay the shareholders back with dividends, but if they go insolvent, then the shareholders lose.
Yes, we're just talking about, say, shares.
It's not just. I don't think we are just talking about share capital, because capital can be profit on lending.
Yeah.
But it's capital that is not actually represented by outstanding loans, is my understanding.
So if I buy shares in National Westminster Bank, that's part of their capital. If I put £20 in National Westminster Bank, part of their deposit.
And that's an asset. You're putting. Yes.
It's your assets, their liability.
Yeah, but if they lend you money, that's their asset.
Yes, that's the difference, isn't it? Yes.
Let's park it. Let's not. That's had enough time, I think. The capital.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Chris. Thank you. And the next one, Peter. Where does money come from? A graphic novel.
It's a graphic novel, right? Well, I don't. I just thought we'd better have. If you'd like to just pass that round. It's black and white. Should be black and white, seems to turn out pink and white version of this so-called graphic novel, which is, I would call a cartoon strip.
Yeah, I told them about that.
But anyway.
I told them to change that. I think they might have changed it.
And if it's a novel, normally you don't go to a novel for the truth, or not usually. But anyway, it's an interesting sort of way of getting across.
Too much to read in the light that I want to listen to.
I've got notes here, so I know.
Get hold of it from anywhere?
Yeah,
from the Positive Money website. Yes,
Okay.
it's on the blog. It's been created by an Irishman,
Where does money come from?
John O'Flynn. He's an illustrator and painter based in Dublin. And he doesn't mention the euro at all. It's all based entirely on the Bank of England. So quite how and why he decided to do it, I don't know. But anyway, and it seems to be designed for young people, which is, again, I admire this idea of getting across as easily as possible. But for me, there are various problems with it, and as I say, I shall go through those. He first of all says that the banks intermediate savings and loans, but suggests they do this only partly, whereas we now know they never do it at all. So that's, there are, as I say, various errors in it, which I think is a pity.
What do you mean they never do it?
Well, they don't intermediate between deposits and loans.
Okay.
Do they?
No.
No.
They don't. They create loans out of thin air, regardless of what the deposits are. So they're not.
Deposits are not tied up in any way when a loan is made.
Precisely. Yeah.
And so they don't even need deposits at all, as we just.
No, exactly.
It's a bookkeeping convention, isn't it? The whole thing, really.
Yeah. So that's, to me, he starts off on the wrong foot.
Peter, can I interrupt? I'm really sorry. This person is a positive money person, John O'Flynn.
Well, he's a positive money follower, as far as I understand,
right, okay.
And he draws cartoons and things, and that's what he's done. And then you get further on. There's a picture that suggests that money is oil, which is the old thing of facilitating. It's much easier than barter, so we monetize the economy, and it becomes oil. It sort of greases the exchange, and whereas of course money isn't oil, money is fuel, because we wouldn't the economy won't function, it won't improve without actually getting money to support it. So as I say, we can't have this I mean, his picture, therefore, is putting money into the engine block is rather confusing. I mean, all he could do, I suppose, is have a two-stroke motor, and he put in a mixture of petrol and oil in the fuel tank. But
couldn't he just put petrol in the fuel tank?
Well, he could, yeah.
I mean,
Exactly. Yeah, he could. But I mean, but obviously, money does help things, help exchange. I mean, I do accept that. It's not its primary purpose.
Okay, right.
That's what I mean.
So that's why the two.
Yeah. And also the other thing I find odd, he's got a picture when there's somebody defaulting on a loan, there's shown as being just outside the debtor's prison. Well, if it's designed for young people, I find that rather odd. You know, we fortunately got rid of them some time ago. And then
maybe not in Dublin.
well, that could be. Maybe that's it. And then he goes on to suggest he suggests that over-lending would lead to withdrawal of the banking license. Now, I mean, you know, that doesn't seem to have happened in the recent past, because, you know, we've learned that the financial crisis is really because we employ too many nurses and there's an excess of lollipop ladies. Nothing to do with the financial sector at all, and so their licenses are forever. So I mean, I think that's a bit confusing that he says that he goes through all this business that banking license can be withdrawn. I mean, I don't know when the last one was, but I think it must be BCCI or something like that. Yeah. I don't know, but I mean, in the recent past, none's been withdrawn. And then his next bit is he goes into the business of goldsmiths lending out notes and lending out more than the actual gold they have in their possession. And he, again, I think he goes off the rails when he suggests that this is the origin of the fractional reserve, because in Britain we've never had a fractional reserve banking system. I believe they have in America. I don't know if that's right. Possibly, anyway. But I mean, it's much talked about, but I mean, it doesn't exist. It never existed in Britain.
What do you mean by fractional reserve?
Fractional reserve, i.e., you take in £100 and then you can lend out 10% of it, and so on and so on.
90%.
Well,
90%. Keep 10% and lend out 90%.
Does this relate to a certain liquidity ratio, which because it's not recognised that banks create money when they sort of make loans? Nobody's quite fussed that the liquidity ratio doesn't actually, even if there was one, it doesn't actually stop.
But the bank doesn't control that either. They don't control liquidity ratios. He comes to that.
But isn't that what the notion of fractional reserve banking was based on a certain liquidity ratio?
Yes, I agree with that.
So the fractional reserve is a imperative. The fractional reserve system is where you have to have a certain fraction of what you lend out.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
You have to hold it back.
Yes, I thought we had that.
Well, the gold standard, wasn't that the gold standard?
No.
We don't. We've never had it in the UK.
No, we never had it.
No, as far as I'm aware. I mean, I'm pretty certain that's true. But I think they may have had it in America, but I'm not even sure of that. But it's much talked about.
Well, I think we had a liquidity ratio until the Thatcher government abolished it in 1981. It might not have been an adequate one, but there was one as far as I know.
You may be right.
Which is the same thing as a fractional reserve.
Well, here it is, but it makes no difference because the theory is based on ignorance of the fact of how banks create money.
True. You may have a point there. It's something I haven't researched. But anyway, I think if this is designed for young people, fractional reserves are sort of difficult to understand, and if they don't exist, then I don't personally think there's much to be gained by talking about it. But anyway, then he goes on about how to create how to get a banking license, which is also rather interesting. It's designed for school kids. Perhaps it's designed if any of them are thinking of starting a bank as a career choice. I think that's probably what we all ought to be doing, in fact.
I don't think anyone will read this. I don't think anyone will read this.
So, and his point is that bank reserves have replaced gold, which I think is a fair point. And then he, then I think he goes he contradicts really his part intermediation suggestion by saying that a bank simply types loan into existence, which we know is true. So he's got that right. But as I say, he started off by suggesting they were intermediators. And then he saw the old point that 97% of money is created by banks. He repeats, which I personally think is not true. But this is
why, because of QE.
Partly because of QE, and partly because I had a conversation with Positive Money on this. Do they believe that the government creates money when it buys things or spends into the economy? And
I can talk a bit about that in my next.
The consensus of opinion is that they do. So in which case, as 40% of GDP is roughly government expenditure, then 97% of money created cannot be created by the banks. But anyway, my thought is...
But don't they only spend it when they have borrowed it?
Yes.
Or when they've either raised taxes or borrowed it by issuing bonds?
This is the old argument. You see, I don't believe we tax and spend, I believe we spend and tax. Because after all, you can't... The government has to create money before you can pay your taxes in it. Logic dictates that...
It has to operate the system.
If they want to collect your tax in pound sterling, they have to create that pound sterling before you can pay your tax in it.
Well, there has to be a system which the government has, in some sense, underwritten. But
comes the same thing. They have to create the money before you can pay your tax in it.
Creating the units in it isn't the same thing as underwriting a general system.
Yes,
they don't create units. They guarantee that there is such a thing as a currency and legal tender. That doesn't mean they create the units. They create units in that legal tender. I don't think it is the same thing.
I think we should park it because I can.
I think that's a really interesting issue.
To me, it's the most important issue. Anyway, that's...
We'll park it, but why don't we come back to it?
I'm going to talk about it when we get to this next bit of the blog.
Anyway, it'd be interesting. As I say, I had conversations and the consensus of opinions seems to be that Positive Money do believe that actually the government spends money into existence and destroys it when it collects taxes. Anyway, then it goes on. Yes, the bank reserves form a very tiny part of the enormous number of transactions that take place every day, which I think is a very fair point. And also he mentions interest rates, how banks can lend reserves to each other if they need to, and also how it's dependent on the central bank's interest rates. Their own rates that they would charge to each other would relate to the central bank's interest rate. I have to say I don't think they do much reserve lending these days, but I think they have done in the past. And he also, this is where he says that the reserves were 11% apparently on average in 1987 and 1.6% in 2006, which is interesting. But as I say, as I understand it, the Bank of England doesn't actually have any control over them. Avert control. They probably have a word in somebody's ear, I expect.
No, because they're the ones that create reserves.
The Bank of England?
Yeah, they're the ones that create it. It's now something like 20% now, because of course QE is, they pay for QE with reserves.
Yes, I'm just going to say, well, that's what he says, that starting your bank, you have to buy bonds as your reserves. Is that right? Is that the same point as you're making?
Maybe. You've got to buy bonds, which you then give. The Bank of England buys and gives you reserves, which gives you the ability then to be liquid. But the reserves are so massive now because of QE that
no problem.
They're going to fall. They will fall.
Well, only if QE gets whatever you called it.
Unwound.
Unwound.
That's the plan.
Yeah, I don't think it'll ever happen personally.
No.
Let's hope it does.
So and I think he concludes, I think, by saying people should go to the Bank of England quarterly bulletin, money creation in the modern economy. So, I mean, that's a nice way to conclude. And I think that the cartoon strip is a good idea. I don't think it's terribly well executed. I think it's a bit busy, not that easy to read, but there's a lot of information in it, to be fair.
First page is
And
okay.
sorry?
The first page is okay.
Yeah, well, quite. And if it gets people, even if it gets school children talking about money and where it comes from, you know, it can't be, it's not all bad. But there are, as I say, I do have some problems with it. But, you know, it's worth looking at if you look at the website just to see.
I mean, I suppose the issue is, should Positive Money put that sort of thing on their blog with so many
Errors,
incorrect
yeah,
errors?
right, I think that-
Yeah.
It undermines it, doesn't it?
It does a bit.
It does a bit.
I might talk to them about this and ask
Yeah,
them
what do you
to-
think?
Why
You think you-
I think that it's not clear and it won't win anyone over
No.
because it's too technical for an introduction and it's too inconsistent to be compelling to someone who knows the area. You know,
Yeah.
I think mostly what it does is appeals to people who already agree with the broad principle of it and aren't actually going to read it, and then they share it because they think that it's a good representation, but they haven't looked at it in detail. And I think I might ask them to take it off the blog because or for the guy to rewrite it or something. Just
It's
because
done better in 2 pages max, couldn't it?
Well, I just feel that, you know, realistically, it's like it's not even mobile friendly. No kids gonna.
No, that's probably true. That's probably true.
It's more complicated than the
It is
video.
it is a bit busy, isn't it? I mean, you're looking
Yeah.
at it from here, there's a lot of information in every sort of square.
Imagine
Yeah.
trying to look at that on a phone.
Yes.
And it jumps around as well, doesn't it? Yes.
Well,
Anyway.
yeah. Well, thanks, Peter. That's great. Any other points we want to?
Well, did you want to critique it further, Peter? I wasn't sure whether you.
No, that's it. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, you know, as I say, it's well, could do better, but I mean, it's
Much better.
1 out of 10.
With a bit of soup up, it could be.
yes,
It could be 7 out of 10 and could improve to 9 out of 10, couldn't it?
yes, yeah. No, I think, but I do think it could be better drawn, really, too. Because I think that a lot of the squares are very busy. There's a lot of information every.
My impression was that fractional reserve banking, I always thought it meant something different from the way you give it, though I might be quite wrong. I thought it meant that it referred to any system in which what the bank held on deposit did not have to equal what it was lending, and therefore was only a fraction of what it was lending.
Yeah, well, effectively, that's it.
But then that's true of everything, isn't it?
I see what you mean. Yes. Yeah, that's
The
true.
fraction,
I'd love to
the
touch on
reserve,
this.
the reserve that banks have with the central bank is the money which they need, the liquidity they need just to move money back. That's all it is.
For clearance, for daily clearance purposes.
Yes.
That's all its
Yes.
purpose. And now there's so many much reserve that they don't have a liquidity problem. But if they did, the Bank of England would be the liquidity bank of last resort and would always give them the money.
Yes, it's just that what the meaning of the term fractional reserve. I just always give it a much broader meaning than the meaning
Yes.
that Peter gave.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, isn't it one of the problems? We're using terms that we don't actually, you know, different people.
Yeah.
The terminology is a real issue.
Richard,
Yes, that's right.
the conclusion, or he used fractional reserve in the context of these goldsmiths.
Yeah.
So I mean,
He's using it in the broad sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Right. Thanks very much. Thanks to our other 3 speakers for helping us get out the evening. Most grateful. And look forward to seeing you next month.
Yeah.
Thank you
Brilliant.
very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I hope you
Thank you.